Everyone can be seated. Continue and counsel in the cross-exam.
Good afternoon, Dr. Taylor.
Good afternoon.
When you began your involvement with this case, what date was that you became involved?
The initial letter I received was dated February 7, 2011.
When you became involved and you started to receive information or documents, was that an ongoing process?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And how did you compile all that information? Did you have it all in paper form, or was that something you had electronically?
Some of the information was in paper form. Some of it was contained in compact discs that I viewed on the computer. And towards the latter part of receiving information, some of it was sent to me electronically, and I viewed it through my email. Most of it was paper or compact discs.
In the records, I believe you indicated that there were military records and documents going back to the year 1993.
Yes, the records of treatment went back to the year 1993. Now, I received her military records per se, her records of service, which began in 1983 and ended in 1993. But the records of actual medical or mental health treatment actually began after she was discharged and was a military dependent, beginning February 1, 1994. Was the first date of the first record.
Can you estimate the amount of pages that you received or reviewed in documents for this case?
Thousands.
And as a result of everything that you reviewed, your report was a quite lengthy report.
Yes, it is the most lengthy report I've done in 25 years of practice.
And every case will be different as far as the amount of information that you receive to prepare in order to evaluate a person.
Yes.
And when you generated your report, would it be accurate to say that the majority of your report is a summary or pieces of information that you gathered from the records that you received and the information that you received in this case?
Yes. The first, it looks like the first 122 pages of the report essentially summarized all of the information that I received in the case. So then there was about 60 pages after that, which summarized my interviews of the defendant and then included my diagnosis and opinion section.
When you reviewed the case, you didn't leave it to those documents alone. You also interviewed Ms. Schenecker.
Yes.
Have you ever conducted any type of evaluation forensically where you did not speak to the person that you were evaluating?
A few times, but it would be very rare. There are some instances where I'm asked to give an opinion based solely on records review. It's usually a limited opinion with the qualification that I did not actually interview the person, and that's not usually done in criminal cases. That's sometimes done in civil cases such as disability evaluations. Every now and then you are asked to do an evaluation in a criminal case and the individual refuses to talk with you. And in some of those cases, you have enough collateral information to arrive at an opinion regarding usually something like competence to stand trial. Sometimes if you don't have enough information, you simply cannot provide an opinion. So it is a rare circumstance that you conduct an evaluation and do a report and render an opinion without actually interviewing the person, but in certain cases it is possible.
And in this case, you in fact interviewed Ms. Schenecker on multiple occasions.
Yes, I interviewed her 5 times for a total of 13 hours.
Now those 5 times in 13 hours, what was your average length of stay when you would speak to Ms. Schenecker?
The first 4 interviews averaged about 3 hours. The last one, I believe, was about an hour and a half.
Okay. You're interviewing her, speaking to her, as well as the other doctors that are involved in the case have also spoken to her multiple times.
Yes, that is my understanding.
When you received the records involved in this case, there was a persistent diagnosis in the USF records, especially leading up from 2009 to 2011, that it indicates there's a history of bipolar 1 with psychotic features versus schizoaffective disorder.
I know I saw several mentions of bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features. I think I may have seen 1 or 2 references to schizoaffective disorder, but that was not a commonly listed diagnosis.
In her jail medical records, was there a time when she was diagnosed as possibly having schizophrenia?
I know there was a time when there was an issue about whether she was psychotic. I would have to check the records. I don't specifically recall a diagnosis of schizophrenia. I think they may have considered a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder.
And as far as did you come to an independent diagnosis for Ms. Schenecker on this case?
Yes, I arrived at what I feel were the diagnoses that met criteria based on her history.
Now, as far as her, what is the difference between, what is an Axis 1 diagnosis?
Well, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was actually the predominant one in use until May of a year ago, it broke diagnoses down into 5 axes, axis 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Axis 1 is where you code the mental disorders which are usually the focus of treatment. They can be psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. They can be mood disorders such as bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder. They can be anxiety disorders such as panic disorder. And they also can be things like substance use disorders, either alcohol abuse or dependence, cocaine or opioid abuse or dependence, things like that.
And when you evaluated Ms. Schenecker, you diagnosed her with bipolar 2 disorder?
Yes.
And you did not render any opinion about her having psychotic features, or you believe she didn't have psychotic features as part of her diagnosis?
That's correct. I did not say that she had experienced either a manic episode or a depressive episode that was associated with psychotic features, which would have given rise to that diagnosis.
And that diagnosis is contrary to the diagnosis that she had at USF. Her last diagnosis was bipolar 1 with psychotic features.
I would have to verify that because, again, I know that at various times she was diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder, and at other times she was diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder. I'll review the records from USF. And these are the records from when she was in treatment with Dr. Obregon
Yes.
at USF. Dr. Obregon made an initial diagnosis of bipolar disorder with a history of psychotic features, which was in remission, as well as alcohol abuse and pathological gambling. He noted cluster B personality traits on axis 2. As treatment progressed, on his final note, he added opioid dependence or abuse as an axis 1 diagnosis and borderline personality disorder as an axis 2 diagnosis.
Well, on his axis 2 diagnosis, he has ruled out borderline personality disorder.
Right, he was considering that as an axis 2 diagnosis.
Not that that was his diagnosis.
Right, he had not established that as a firm diagnosis. He indicated that that was something that he was considering as an axis 2 diagnosis.
And as far as his axis 1 diagnosis at that time, his last entry on December 28, 2010, he has bipolar 1 disorder with history of psychotic features.
Correct.
Okay. No indication about it being in remission, just that there's a history of psychotic features.
That's correct.
Now, when you reviewed the records, did you have an opinion about her having a history of psychotic features?
I saw one episode from the summer of 2009 in which during that time she was concerned that her husband was going to discover the amount of time she was spending gambling and how much money she was losing. She began to express fears that he was having somebody follow her. She began to have fears that there were cameras placed in the house to monitor her. On one occasion, she expressed concern that when she went to see her psychiatrist that there was a camera in the room. So in my opinion, that probably crossed the line into what would be considered a psychotic feature.
And at that time on July 6th of 2009, the thoughts that she was talking about with her husband having cameras in the house and a fear that there were cameras in the interview room, she said that the thoughts she was having about her husband having cameras in the house, that was a thought she had had for 2 years.
Yeah, she said for the past 2 years she'd had concerns that her husband had cameras in the house.
In your opinion, is that goes over into the line of being a psychotic thought in 2009?
Well, first of all, I don't see any evidence that that thought had been going on for any more than a few weeks, because she had never mentioned it up until that period of time. But in my opinion, that probably did cross the line into which she experienced a brief psychotic episode.
And there were times in her records where she had reported at night she had illusions of the comforter changing into angels.
Yes, I'd seen a few references, usually during initial evaluations when a standard question is, do you ever see things that other people don't see, or have you ever seen things that weren't really there? And I know that she made two different comments at various times. One was at night thinking that a comforter was in the shape of an angel, and another time thinking that when a television set was turned off, she thought she saw an image in the television set of an angel.
And on that time with the television set, what the doctor indicated on March 28, 2007 is that she shared a psychotic experience of watching images on her television set.
Correct. That was the way it was described.
There was a time also back in March 14th, 2007, where the doctor indicated that she showed being anxious with some psychotic features because she was reporting having to invent something to earn money to support herself.
Well, first of all, that was not a doctor, that was a social worker. And secondly, yes, she told the social worker that she felt like she believed her husband was going to abandon her, and she felt the need to invent something so that she could earn money to support herself, and the social worker described her as having anxious mood with some psychotic features.
And at that time, she didn't want to take her medication because she was afraid it would stop her from being creative, and she needed to invent something to support herself.
Yes, that's correct.
She's been described at that point as having racing thoughts.
Yes.
She's also had a history of suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideations.
Yes.
In the course of the records that you've reviewed, there's multiple times where she indicates that she would not commit suicide because of her children.
Yes, there's been times when she has acknowledged that she had thought about suicide, but she would not kill herself because of the children.
When she was at the National Institute of Health, she was undergoing a treatment there called transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what that is?
Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a treatment in which a magnetic pulse is sent through the brain of an individual that's usually being treated for depression as a means of alleviating the symptoms of depression. It's based on the fact that for many years it's been known that electroconvulsive therapy, which is also known as shock therapy or shock treatment, is an effective treatment for severe depression. And over the years there's been several other modalities in which they've looked to see if maybe another type of treatment would provide the same benefits and have fewer side effects. And transcranial magnetic stimulation is the one that's probably been used the most in that regard.
And while Ms. Schenecker is there, they're taking her off her medication and baselining her, trying to render an accurate opinion of what her mental health diagnosis would be.
Well, first they did an assessment and arrived at an opinion regarding what her mental health diagnosis was. They then tapered and discontinued the medications she was taking in preparation to be entered into the treatment protocol.
And they rendered an opinion on what her diagnosis would be?
Well, they rendered an opinion regarding what her diagnosis was when they admitted her.
Which was bipolar 1?
Well, the initial diagnosis was bipolar disorder not otherwise specified.
And at the completion of it, their diagnosis changed?
At the time of her discharge from the program, the diagnosis was bipolar disorder type 1, most recent episode mixed, and currently mildly depressed.
When she left that facility and she ended up going to Germany, the psychiatrist that took her, was the next one to treat her, referred to her medications that she was on as an incredible cocktail of psychotropic medication.
Yes, before she was discharged from the NIH facility, she was following the transcranial magnetic stimulation treatment. She was prescribed one psychotropic medication after another until by the time she was discharged, she was on 7 psychotropic medications. When she saw the psychiatrist in Germany a few months later, his note was that she was on what he described as an incredible cocktail. She told me something very similar, that when he looked at her medications, he threw up his hands and said, "I've never seen such a cocktail."
And from the records that you reviewed, her condition or her illness was very difficult to treat.
Yes.
She was very difficult to potentially stabilize even in a controlled environment at NIH.
Yes.
And as far as her having a major mental health or a severe mental health diagnosis, you would agree that she suffers from a severe form of mental illness?
Yes, I would. It is my opinion that she does suffer from a form of bipolar disorder.
And when you were taking the records and rendering your ultimate opinion, you indicated that one of the things that you gave great weight to was the journal or the writings of Ms. Schenecker that were provided to you.
Yes, in terms of rendering an opinion regarding her sanity at the time of the alleged offenses, that was certainly something that I gave great weight to.
Now, when you're taking everything into consideration, are you only taking bits and pieces, or is it important to look at the whole, everything that you've been provided?
Certainly to look at the whole.
And when you review the journal, she indicates in her journal an expression of why she has shot the children.
Yes.
And her explanation in the journal is that she shot the children because she had to save them.
Yes, in her words, she did not want them to have problems with bipolar disorder or similar problems such as she had.
Now, she has had times where she's been trying to explain her illness to her family members, including her daughter, in the letter that you reviewed in this case.
Yes, I did omit mentioning that, but in November 2008, she wrote a letter to Calix in which she attempted to explain her problematic behaviors, which Calix did not like, in terms of explaining them as a result of her mental illness and asking her to understand.
And there are times when she talked about that letter to her psychiatrist and to her therapist, the letter to Calix.
Yes.
And there are expressions throughout the records that Ms. Schenecker indicates that her family doesn't understand her mental illness and doesn't understand her condition.
Yes, many times.
And when she is seeking treatment, she is including at times her husband to go to therapy as a couple.
Yes, relatively rarely, but there were a few times that happened.
And there were times when she also had the children involved, especially in December of 2010.
Yes, the children accompanied her to 2 sessions with her therapist in December 2010.
When you're considering Ms. Schenecker's appreciation for what she's done or the consequences of her actions, as far as having an understanding of that, are you taking into consideration her interview with the Tampa Police Department?
Yes.
Are you taking into consideration her actions after the shooting?
Yes.
There are indications in the journal that she expresses concern about the children being cold and placing blankets on them.
Yes.
And she writes about hugging and kissing her daughter and putting her to bed.
Yes.
And there are indications that she, at times where she said that she saw a lot of blood, and then there's times when she indicates that she didn't see much blood.
Yes.
And when Calyx is placed in her bed, there's an indication from her in her recorded statement where she put a towel so that the bed wouldn't be messy, or in her journal that she put a towel.
Yes.
Now, when she's talking about Bo, there's an expression that she's trying to put Bo in the bed with her because that's where he rested comfortably.
Yes.
And she expresses repeatedly that she's not able to lift him and that she wishes she could lift him.
Yes.
And when you observe the photos, Bo is buckled up or still has his seatbelt on in the car.
Yes.
There's no indication that Ms. Schenecker would not physically have the strength to pick him up.
I don't know whether she would have or not.
She never unbuckled the seatbelt.
As far as I know, she did not.
When Ms. Schenecker talks about the plans after the children, after she was going to kill herself, she wanted all of their bodies to be cremated and mixed together.
I recall that she said to cremate them and donate their body to science. I don't recall whether it was mixing them together or not, but it may have been.
In fact, she states, cremate me, maybe donate our bodies to science if it's not too late. If you could cremate the kids, mix our ashes so we can be together.
Yes.
And she indicates that they would all go together to heaven.
Yes, that was her hope.
And there are times in the interview where she indicates to law enforcement that this is the worst thing I've ever done.
Yes, she made one statement regarding that.
And then when law enforcement asks her if the children are dead, she states, I don't know.
Yes, that was what she initially stated.
And then when they ask her, what does she think? She says, I hope so.
Yes, she said, I hope they're dead.
You would agree, doctor, that there's a lot of back and forth between what she's saying, if the kids are alive or dead, if she's putting them to sleep. There's a lot of indications for both of those things in Ms. Schenecker's journal as well as in her statement to law enforcement.
Well, I would say that in some of her later journal entries, there are the beginnings of that, and then there's even more of it in her statement to during her interview with detectives the next day, which certainly significantly, by that time she had consumed a significant quantity of alcohol and overdosed on multiple medications, which ultimately resulted in her being admitted to a hospital later that evening. So I do believe that, especially by the time she was speaking to detectives, she was at times clear, but at times confused regarding whether the children were actually dead. And I think that the beginnings of that were being seen in some of her later journal entries that day. Certainly the initial journal entries after the shootings were very clear that she was aware that they were dead, but then some of the later ones, she did mix in things like putting them to bed and hugging and kissing them and putting blankets on them.
Now, you would agree, doctor, that you can be insane and still have an intent to kill someone.
Yes.
And you would agree that you can know what you're doing and its consequences and that you're intending to cause death and you could still be insane?
Yes, if you know what you're doing and its consequences, but as a result of a mental illness, you feel like what you are doing is right and you don't know that what you're doing is illegal, then you could at that point meet the legal criteria for insanity. And I would give as an example, there was a case recently where I was retained by the Office of the State Attorney to evaluate a woman who had killed her infant child. Now, she had made several statements immediately after she was arrested indicating that she believed that her infant child had died and that the child's body was being inhabited by Satan. She was very consistent in making these statements in the period immediately around the alleged offenses. I rendered an opinion that that woman was insane at the time of the alleged offenses. So there are situations where it can do it. She was intending to kill the child, but because she believed the child was, she had a delusion that the child was, body was inhabited by Satan, that she didn't feel like she was doing anything wrong. So it is possible in circumstances like that. I just don't feel like that fits in this case.
And someone can be insane and still act purposefully, determined to execute their plan.
Yes, somebody can purposefully act and execute a plan and be insane if they don't know that their plan is wrong.
And when someone is insane or having psychotic thoughts, they can still appear normal to outside people.
That is possible, but it is less likely. Most people that are having symptoms of psychosis, even to the lay observer, they usually appear to have something wrong with them. It is theoretically possible, but I would say unlikely.
When Ms. Schenecker is talking about if I get to go to heaven, there are several times that she's talking to law enforcement after they arrive at her home where she's asking for her firearm or for their firearm to finish what she had planned.
Well, yes, I know to the officers that investigated at the house, she asked for the firearm and said she wanted to use it on herself. While she was being interviewed by the detective, she said, Bo went first, Calix went second, I would like to go third. So she was still experiencing suicidal thoughts.
And she asked in the interview for her gun.
I don't specifically recall that, but I would not be surprised if she didn't.
From the time that Ms. Schenecker was in Winmore and was released from Winmore, you would agree that at that time she was in a severe depressed state?
Yes, in my opinion, while she was in Winmore, she met criteria for a major depressive episode. In my opinion, it became worse after she was discharged from Winmore on until the alleged offenses occurred.
And when she's going to see Dr. Obregon, she's then indicating on December 10th and December 28th that she's having these suicidal thoughts.
Yes, she voiced suicidal thoughts on both of those occasions.
And when she goes to see Miss Marsh, I believe, or maybe it's Dr. Obregon, at one point she states that she's thinking about suicide daily.
Yes, she did.
Now, you would agree, Doctor, a woman who has had an incident where she slapped her daughter, she gets into a car accident on the way to AA, she's in rehab. When she gets out of rehab, she's in bed every day, not functioning with her family, and she's going to see these doctors and telling them that she's having suicidal thoughts. You agree that at that point she should have been hospitalized?
Yes, in my opinion, it would have been beneficial for her to have been hospitalized at that time.
And even if she didn't meet, per the psychiatrist, Baker Act criteria, you agree that she should have been at that point convinced or talked into going to the hospital?
Yes, certainly looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it was clear that her mental condition was deteriorating. And at some point, probably around late December, it would have been advisable for her to be either talked into a voluntary admission to where she would agree to be hospitalized for her own good.
And in fact, that's something that you've done before in your practice.
Yes, it is.
The HIPAA requirements, you would still be able to, as a practicing psychiatrist, speak to a family member just to inform them that you believe that your patient should be hospitalized.
Yes.
If I could have one moment. Nothing further.
Doctor, you've indicated that in most cases, if an individual was in a psychotic state or condition, that they would exhibit some type of behavior or outward appearance that would enable a normal person to know that something was wrong.
In most cases, especially with any type of repeated exposure to the person, it might be possible to hide an episode of psychosis for a few minutes or even a few hours, but over a period of time, usually even a layperson would be able to notice that there's some type of problem.
Would you expect that to be exhibited in any special or objective behavior or conduct? That's badly said. Let me say that over. What type of behavior might lead a normal person to figure that a person who's psychotic, there's something wrong with them?
Well, it depends on the type of psychotic symptom. If somebody is hallucinating, at some point they can usually be observed responding to the hallucination, either by talking back to it or, for instance, the most common type is an auditory hallucination where you think you hear somebody talking to you. It would be common for them to either talk back to it or respond in some other way. If somebody has a delusional belief, again, if it's a brief interaction with somebody, they might not voice the delusional belief. Usually if they have prolonged or repeated exposure to somebody, then it would be more likely that they would at some point express what their delusional belief is.
Okay. You've indicated that in hindsight, the defendant should have been hospitalized or talked into hospitalization at or near the time of the offense. Is that correct?
Yes, prior to the alleged offenses.
Given that opinion, even though, in your opinion, Ms. Schenecker should have been hospitalized, does that mean that she didn't retain the capacity to know that killing her children were wrong, or that she didn't retain the capacity to understand the nature and consequences of her act?
No, in my opinion, despite her deteriorating mental condition, she retained the capacity to know what she was doing and its consequences, and that to know that what she was doing was wrong.
Thank you. Nothing further.
May this witness be excused?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, you may step down. You're free to go.
May I step outside to check the lobby? Thank you, Your Honor. In the state of Florida, we call Dr. Barbara Stein.
Do you swear or affirm the testimony you will give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. See, please, right here.
You inquire. Thank you. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the court reporter.
Barbara Ann Stein, S-T-E-I-N.
What is your profession or occupation, ma'am?
I am a licensed physician, and I specialize in forensic psychiatry.
Dr. Stein, can you tell the jury, please, your education, training, and experience that enables you or qualifies you to practice forensic psychiatry?
Sure. Well, first of all, after graduating college, I went to medical school. That was a 4-year program after the 4 years of college. And then I did a residency, which was 4 years in the field of psychiatry, which is a subspecialty of medicine. And then I went on and I did what's called fellowship training. It's a 1-year program in the area of forensic psychiatry, and that is the recognized subspecialty of psychiatry and the law.
The fellowship that you mentioned, is that common among forensic psychiatry practitioners of forensic psychiatry?
It's required it has been required as of, I believe, 1999, that one must take the fellowship in order to become board certified in the subspecialty. You also have to have board certification in general adult psychiatry before you can be allowed to become board certified in forensic psychiatry. So I'm boarded in both areas.
And what does that mean, board certified?
That means, with regard to general psychiatry, that I completed a residency program. I passed about 9 months after the program a written exam. About 9 months after that, passed an oral exam, and it means that I at least met the standard that's required to be considered a competent psychiatrist. And then in forensic psychiatry, there's a written examination, and I passed that as well, so I'm double boarded.
Okay. Dr. Stein, how long have you been practicing forensic psychiatry?
Since 1992.
Oh, about 21 years or 22?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And have you had a clinical practice too at times?
Yes.
When you talk about forensic psychiatry, is that devoted exclusively to issues arising in criminal cases?
No, it also involves civil matters and what's called administrative matters. And I've had forensic practice that has included all of those. Basically, in the civil realm, it's when people bring a lawsuit and they're claiming emotional damages and they're saying that something harmed them or they're discriminated against. And that's when a forensic psychiatrist will get involved. And then administratively, probably over the last 19 years, I've been the main individual in the state of Florida who has evaluated licensed healthcare professionals who are accused of professional boundary violations or sexual misconduct with patients.
In the criminal setting within forensic psychiatry, have you been involved in cases where you were asked to render opinions as to an individual's state of mind at the time of an offense?
Yes.
Can you give the jury a ballpark figure on how many such cases you've been involved over the last 21 years or before?
Probably pretty close to about 2,000 competency sanity evaluations since 1991, because when I was in my fellowship, that was part of the program, of course, getting training in how to do that type of forensic assessment in the criminal realm.
Okay. And during your 21 or so years in practice as a forensic psychiatrist, have you been retained on behalf of both of individuals charged with criminal conduct and by the prosecuting authorities?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Have you been allowed to testify as an expert and express an opinion as to an individual's state of mind at the time of the offense, including issues of insanity, in the courts in the state of Florida?
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of approximately how many times you've been so qualified?
I would say probably about 50 times, maybe 30 to 50 times.
All right. Your Honor, I would tender the witness as to her qualifications to express an opinion.
No questions.
You may continue.
Thank you. Dr. Stein, did you become associated by the state of Florida, the state attorney's office, through my person, to become involved in this case, state of Florida versus Julie Schenecker?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And in a nutshell, were you requested to conduct your evaluation in this case to address issues of the defendant's state of mind at the time of the offense?
Yes.
Did you receive from the state attorney's office and any other sources background information, medical records, police reports, things of that nature?
Yes, I did.
Can you give the jury an overview of the type of materials to this date that you have been provided and have considered in your work on this case?
Sure. I looked at the jail medical records of Ms. Schenecker from the time that she was traveling with her husband for military purposes, and she would need to see a psychiatrist. So there were various records. They're called military dependent records. Her military records, Also, University of South Florida's health records or psychiatry records. There were various CDs with photographs of the crime scene, alleged crime scene, and also police reports. The written and audio taped 12811 police interview of Ms. Schenecker, the Tampa General Hospital records. This was from, I believe, 129 or late on 128 to 13011. There was also a audio-visual of a 12911 interview at Tampa General Hospital by her defense team. There were probably about 15 or 20, maybe even more, depositions of police officers, detectives. There was one of Calix's coach, maybe a teacher of Bo's. There were some letters pertaining to family history of psychiatric problems in Ms. Schenecker's family. Also, there was what's called a mitigation letter that was prepared by the defense to the prosecution. I was provided various reports, Dr. Donald Taylor's report of his analysis in this case, and I was also provided some testing data that Dr. Wade Myers and Dr. Eldris Solomon had actually testing they had done when they evaluated Ms. Schenecker. There were Winmore records, which was what's called a dual diagnosis substance abuse and mental health facility where Ms. Schenecker had been. A two-page report by a Dr. Daniel Buffington. I believe he's a pharmacologist. There was a journal, a notebook, a spiral notebook that contained, I believe it was about 16 pages of writings that Ms. Schenecker had basically documented her thoughts, her feelings, her actions before and after the alleged crimes. The military records also included information from Walter Reed Behavioral Health, and also there was a Hillsborough County Child Protection Team investigation that pertained to a November 3rd, 2010 incident between Ms. Schenecker and Calix. There were various emails between Ms. Schenecker and Mr. Schenecker, emails between Mr. Schenecker and Dr. Obregon, who was a USF psychiatrist treating Ms. Schenecker, and emails between Mr. Schenecker and some of Ms. Schenecker's family members. At some later point, I received about 18 pages of additional diary or journal entries that Mr. Parker had provided to, I believe, the prosecutor's office, and that was something that Ms. Schenecker had written. It was not clear when they were written, but there were about 18 pages. And, of course, the autopsy reports, and the medical examiner at the time, Dr. Adams, his depositions of some of the experts in the case.
Okay. Did you indicate, and maybe I overlooked, that among the medical records would have been her treatment by USF Medical Clinic?
Yes, that was in there. The other thing that I didn't mention is there was a surveillance tape of Ms. Schenecker's visit to, I believe it was called Lock and Load Gun Shop on 12211 and 12711. I also did read Mr. Tanso's, the gun shop owner's deposition. That was among the depositions that I read.
In addition to those source materials and records that you've just referred to, did you have the opportunity to conduct interviews of this defendant, Julie Schenecker?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell the jury, please, on how many occasions and for what length of time you spent interviewing this defendant?
There were 4 occasions. It was one time in August of 2013, twice in September 2013, and the 4th and final time was December 2013, totaling just about 12 hours.
What was your purpose for interviewing the defendant in arriving at your opinions as to her state of mind 2 years prior to the interviews at the time of the incident?
It is part of the forensic assessment, even in what's called a retrospective assessment, which determining someone's state of mind a couple of years earlier is what we call a retrospective assessment. It still is part of the assessment to talk to the individual who is being charged and who is on trial for an alleged crime or crimes, to get their account of what they feel they were thinking, what their perceptions were, what they did, and it is to be placed always in the context of collateral information. So you're really looking not only to get that person's account, but to look at whether there are any inconsistencies in that person's account with what the facts of the case show, the evidence, very close in time to an alleged crime. And that's the most important evidence, in my opinion, is what was said and what was done before and after, and of course during, if you have information, an alleged crime. That, to me, is the most reliable because as time goes on, as years go on, individuals do tend to have distorted memory. It can be on an involuntary basis or it can be voluntary. So the purpose is to get their account and to get historical information, but to never rely solely on it and to make sure that anything that person tells you is corroborated, is supported by the evidence, especially the evidence close in time to the alleged crimes, which is the most reliable because it's before someone has an opportunity to think about what they're being charged with. It's close in time, so there's not enough time maybe for memory to erode over time, which it does. And they also have not maybe perhaps mounted a defense where there would be a motivation to maybe report things that may not be accurate.
Did you have such information pertinent to the defendant's state of mind at and immediately before and immediately after the crime from collateral sources in this case?
Yes.
What was the nature of that evidence?
There was a fair amount of evidence, but to me, the most pertinent evidence was in the USF psychiatry records because, and that's one. I'll just go through all of them. The USF psychiatry records, the journal entries, the visit to Brandon Internal Medicine Clinic on 1/14/11, the 1/28/11 interview with the police, the Tampa General Hospital records where she was observed in the emergency room. She was then evaluated on 1/29/11 by her defense team, and she was also, I believe, on 1/30 and 1/31 seen by a psychiatric consultant. I think that some of the early jail medical records are very important too, because it allowed me to get a close look at what was this person's thoughts, feelings, actions before and during and after. That's what those documents really provided me. Now, that's not to say that other things weren't important. I mean, some of the emails were very telling, I believe.
Did you attribute any significance in your inquiry as to the defendant's state of mind at before and after the offenses, to a spiral notebook, sometimes referred to as a journal of writings of this defendant on or between the gun, purchase of the gun and the pickup of the gun and murders?
Yes, that was very significant to me.
Before we get into your ultimate opinions and your view of evidence in support of those opinions, can you explain to the jury, please, your understanding of the standards for insanity that guide the opinions that you form?
Yes. In the state of Florida, my understanding is that in order for someone to be considered legally insane, they have to first have a mental disease or defect, and as a result of the mental disease or defect, they did not know what they were doing or the consequences, and if they did not know that it was wrong.
Have you formed an opinion as to the issue of whether this defendant, Julie Schenecker, at the time of the murders of Bo and Kayleigh Schenecker, was legally insane, as that phrase is used within the courts of the state of Florida?
I did not find that she was legally insane under the law in Florida.
If we can address each of the, for lack of a better phrase, the prongs of that legal standard. Did you arrive at an opinion as to whether or not at the time of the offenses this defendant had a mental illness, disease, or defect?
Yes, I did.
And what is your opinion in that regard?
She suffered from a long-standing mental illness, which is defined or described as bipolar type 1, and she also had alcohol abuse or dependence, opioid, which is narcotic pain type medication, dependence. There was probably some what they call sedative hypnotic, or Klonopin is the medication, abuse. And she had various histories that I had recognized in the records, and that's important for a psychiatrist to not just look at one piece of time, but basically to look at someone over time when you want to get an understanding of their diagnosis.
What is meant by the term mood disorder?
Mood disorders are basically an impairment in someone's ability to regulate their mood. And there are various types of mood disorders. The most common one that we think about is depression, major depression, clinical depression. Going up a little bit in severity would be a bipolar disorder, which can be a bipolar 1 type or a bipolar 2 type. Bipolar 1 is more serious, and it's the condition that used to be called manic depressive illness.
Is there a category recognized within psychiatry of psychotic disorders?
Yes.
And what does that mean? What does that phrase mean?
Well, a psychotic disorder implies that someone is out of touch with reality. And typically, the most common one that we think about is schizophrenia. And that is when someone for a period of time has demonstrated that they have, let's say, hallucinations where they might be hearing things that are not there. They might be hearing voices that are telling them to do things. They may be seeing things not there. They also may have delusional thinking, which is of a bizarre nature. When you talk about a psychotic disorder, a serious psychotic disorder, you're talking about someone who has bizarre delusions, and that's what, in fact, what you see in schizophrenia. When I say bizarre, they are like, you know, I got a message from the TV that's telling me that the Martians are ready to invade, or they saw something down the street that's telling them that God and the devil are coming and they're coming after me because I'm a saint. They're bizarre. They're not about regular human everyday life. There is a condition called delusional disorder, which is a much more mild form of psychosis, and the most common one that you hear about in the media is people who believe strongly that a celebrity is in love with them. It's called erotomania. That is a delusional disorder. You can also have a delusional disorder that's of a paranoid nature, but the paranoia is not bizarre. It's something of everyday life. And the difference between a delusional disorder and schizophrenia, which is a major psychotic disorder, is that there's a real deterioration of the person in their functioning and in their appearance over time in schizophrenia, whereas delusional disorder, it's so like encapsulated that people go on with their everyday life, they work, they seem totally normal, they're not deteriorated. So they're very different. And then, of course, you can have, with the mood disorders, to complicate things further, you can have, for example, major depression with psychotic features, or you could have bipolar disorder with psychotic features. And that is when someone is out of touch with reality who happens to have a mood disorder.
A person who has been diagnosed as bipolar disorder with psychotic features, does that indicate that they are out of touch with reality throughout the course and progress of that illness?
No.
Okay. What does that mean then, as far as how often or in what severity those psychotic features may manifest or become involved in their illness?
Well, everybody's different. I mean, you can have a person who has a bipolar disorder, which is a lifelong genetically based, it's a medical disorder, a brain disorder, if you will, and 99% of the time they present as depressed. They might have had a manic episode just once in their whole entire life, and they may never have been psychotic. Then you can have a person who...
And that person would still fit the criteria for bipolar with psychotic features?
That person would not. The next person would be someone who maybe once or twice in their entire life presented with not only the mood disturbance, depression or mania or hypomania of bipolar disorder, but they also have some psychotic symptoms. And that can be bizarre delusions, it can be hallucinating, it can be extreme paranoia, and then you never ever see it again. So everybody's different, and you have to look at the facts of a case. What do the records show? Whether someone has it, when they've had it.
Well, let's talk about your opinion concerning Ms. Schenecker at the time of the offense. You indicated that your diagnosis was she did suffer from a major mental illness, disease, or defect at the time of the offense?
Yes, I did.
And forgive me, but remind me again what your diagnosis was?
Bipolar 1 disorder, most recent episode, depressed, and then there were other diagnoses, but that's the mood disorder.
What does most recent episode depressed mean?
That means that, literally, that her most recent presentation was depression. Because as I just said, when you are bipolar, you can have both ends. You can have mania or you can have depression. And most people don't have a lot of manic episodes. They predominantly present as depression. Some people do have manic episodes. You have to have at least one manic episode in life to get that diagnosis.
Do you have an opinion, doctor, as to whether at the time of the offenses and the days leading up to the offenses, from the time of the gun purchase on January 22nd, 2011, to the commission of the offenses on or about January 27th of 2011, this defendant was psychotic or in a psychotic state.
I do have an opinion.
What is your opinion in that regard, Doctor?
There is no evidence in the records that she was experiencing psychosis. And the most pertinent evidence that I looked at, again, is right before I looked at her USF psychiatry records. Her most recent visit was 1/20/11, no evidence of psychosis. I looked at a 1/14/11 note, Brandon Internal Medicine Clinic. Although they're not psychiatrists, if she had been grossly psychotic, they would have known about it. I looked at the 1/28/11 police interview, the 1/29/11 defense team interview, the jail medical records when she got there, Tampa General when she first got there, and there's absolutely no evidence that she was out of touch with reality. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary that she knew what she was doing or what she had done, the consequences and the wrongfulness of that. Also, her journal is telling as well.
Well, let me ask you about that. There are some writings in the journal that speak to, and I paraphrase, that speak to the killing of the kids to save them from the embarrassment of having a suicidal parent or save them from the potential of bipolar disorder, things of that nature. In your view, is that not evidence of psychosis?
No, that's not evidence of psychosis.
And why not, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, that alone you would never rely on to determine whether someone's psychotic or not. To me, it's a very rational way of thinking that, in her case, I'm in tremendous pain, I'm very depressed, my family's falling apart, I have all these problems, my husband sent an email, would not share it with me. This probably means that he's going to get divorced. We're going to get divorced. I had just been in rehab, and I have all these problems, and so I'm in pain. I want to alleviate my pain, so I'm coming up with a plan to kill myself, and I've decided to take my children with me for a whole host of reasons. One of them that you mentioned is that she does not want them to be left behind with the potential of developing these conditions, because Ms. Schenecker knows it's been extremely painful for her entire life. That's one of a number of reasons that she has reported close in time to the alleged crimes that she took her children with her. That to me is not psychotic. Now, if I looked at the evidence before the alleged crimes, the journal entries, which gives us some insight into during this period, and then I looked at the evidence immediately after, all this stuff that I say is the most pertinent, and I was reading, and I looked at the USF records, and I see that she has a delusional belief. She has a delusional belief that she is being punished by Satan or Martians, and she has to take her life, and she has to take her kids, because if she doesn't, then all of these bizarre things are going to happen to them. That to me would have been sign of psychotic thinking. But when you place that statement and other statements that Ms. Schenecker made about why she planned to kill herself and her children, in the absence of not one shred, in my opinion, based on my review of these records, one shred of evidence that she was in a psychotic state, then that, along with all the other evidence that I've reviewed, tells me there were a number of non-psychotic reasons for her plan.
Okay. Before we address the non-psychotic reasons for the plan that you've alluded to, do you view as a delusion the defendant's concern to which you just alluded, that her husband was about to divorce her?
No, not at all.
And why not?
A number of reasons. Based on the evidence, it was totally reasonable for her to think that this time, after all these years, this could happen. And some of the reasons are that this is the worst that she had been, according to Mr. Schenecker, in his email, I believe, to Dr. Obergen, that she had been in 20 years. She had wrecked a car on November 8th, 2010, under the influence of oxycodone and alcohol. She was forced to go to rehab. Her relationship with her husband had really deteriorated. He had told the family counselor, I believe it was 12/28/10 at USF, that he was no longer going to be walking on eggshells. He also indicated that he and the family, the children, were going on regardless of what she chose to do. Additionally, her relationship with Calix had grossly deteriorated. All of these things are based on reality. This is not something that is a delusion. If you look at the records, all of these things were true. So she certainly had the reasonable belief that she could be put out. In fact, I believe after she was in the accident, her husband sent her to a hotel and said, "You're not coming home." We know that on November 3rd of 2010, and this had never happened before, the Department of Child Protection Services got involved. So everything had come to such a head like nothing before. And then she tells a number of people how angry and upset she is about this email that he sent the day before he left to get deployed on 1/19/11. And she basically says, and even her sister, I believe her sister says in an email to Mr. Schenecker, that she's already feels like she's lost Calix, and I think that if she loses you, she's going to commit suicide. So this is all based on reality. There's no reason whatsoever to believe, based on the evidence, that this was delusional thinking on her part. This was all really happening.
In response to an earlier question just a few minutes ago as to whether or not there was psychotic motives or thinking that was producing or impacting her conduct at the time of the crimes, you indicated in part that there were that there were non-psychotic reasons or motives. Is that correct?
Yes.
What are you referring to? What is your opinion in that regard?
Well,
Yeah, I'm gonna Jeff,
Yep.
May continue.
Thank you. Doctor, please, if you would, what is your opinion in regard to whether or not there were other non-psychotic motives involved in Ms. Schenecker's homicidal conduct on the day of this offense?
My ability to describe other non-psychotic motives comes from the evidence that shows me that in the absence of any evidence of psychosis, that she knew what she was doing, the consequences of it, and the wrongfulness. So my being able to talk about the facts that support that is what will help me to describe other potential non-psychotic motives.
Okay, well, let's put the cart then before the horse.
Okay.
Let me ask you as to the other additional elements of the legal standard of insanity, and I take it from that you're telling me that the evidence equally addresses the evidence supporting your opinion as to motives, non-psychotic motives, would also be similar to the evidence on those opinions. Is that correct?
Yes.
You understood that question, even though it was rambling as it was?
I believe I did.
Okay, thank you. First, do you have an opinion as to whether or not, at the time of these offenses, Ms. Schenecker knew what she was doing?
Yes, I do.
Can you describe for the jury, please, what evidence you based that opinion?
I base it on the journal entries, specifically that she had, part of the journal entries is that she had essentially an apology letter to Parker. If someone has an apology letter, then she knows that there's something wrong. In terms of knowing what she was doing, she talked about, I want to say it was on Sunday, a Sunday journal entry, that she had wanted to commit a Saturday massacre. She talked about after she had committed the acts, that how she had done them, which were very consistent with the evidence in the case. And also she talked about cremating our bodies. She talked about things related to a memorial service. She talked about why she had to shoot her children. And she also talked about why she was not really very comfortable with the idea of shooting herself, because she had already seen the destruction that it had caused when she saw the results of the shootings of her children. Those are some of the journal entries. The emails. One email in particular is the 8:54 p.m. email to her family on 1/27/11, and she says, I'm going to end this soon. When you put that together with everything else, it tells you that she has a plan and she's going to follow through with it. And in fact, she did follow through with it, but for the fact that she fell asleep and could not kill herself because she was found before that happened. Going to the gun store on the 22nd, 2 days after she had seen her therapist. She wasn't psychotic when she saw the therapist, and even though Mr. Tanzo is a layperson, it's completely consistent, his observations with a mental health professional, that she was not psychotic. She was well-groomed, she was friendly, she conversed like a normal person, and she also was deceptive about why she was getting the gun. And so that goes more to perhaps the wrongfulness. The Post-it notes. There's Post-it notes on the front of the house saying to friends and carpool people, something to that effect, we've gone to New York, we'll be back Tuesday. That shows me not only her capacity to reflect and some clarity there, but there was a form of deception there. The Post-it note on the stairway, DNR, donate my body to science. Again, clearly understanding that she was going to shoot herself, and she wanted to offer her body to science. There was a calendar entry on February 1st where she specifically, and I believe that was a day that Mr. Schenecker was coming home from deployment, and she specifically says that Calix is in her room, Bo is in the car. She's very aware of that. That's exactly, where they were, in bed and in the garage in the van. And then there are subsequent calendar notes where she said, cancel this appointment, cancel that appointment, cancel this, unless you want to go, essentially on your own. So she knew when the person who read that, which was meant to be Parker, would know that she was no longer there. She also sent Mr. Schenecker an email on 1/27/11. It was quite late, and it was based on my reading of the evidence after the shootings, where she said, come home, we're all waiting for you. That to me again shows that she knew, she wanted him to come home and see them the way they were. There were spontaneous utterances, police call them spontaneous utterances at the scene, where people make remarks and they record them. And she had said, my husband is going to be so distraught. Again, that indicates to me, in the absence of some psychotic process, which there was no evidence of, she knows her husband's going to be distraught because she did something wrong, because she took his children away from him. She said, I wanted to shoot myself, but I fell asleep. Again, she knows that if she would have shot herself, she would have died. And she knows she shot her children. The detective's interview, which was post-Miranda on 1/28/11.
Judge, I'm going to object to narrative.
Next question, Counselor.
Was there additional evidence that you based your opinion as to the defendant's knowledge of what she had done, in addition to what you've already expressed?
Yes.
What was that?
The 1/28/11 interview with the police and the 1/29/11 interview at Tampa General with the defense team, as well as when she initially got to Hillsborough County Jail, some of the notes there.
Well, let's take that by category. What information did you obtain or consider from the 1/28/2011 interview with Tampa Police Department that you relied upon in your arriving at your opinion that at the time of the offense the defendant knew the nature and consequences of her act?
Well, she was able to describe the number of shots with regard to Bo, with regard to Calix, where they were located. She was able to provide information about how she was feeling and why she did what she did. On 1/29,
Are you now referencing the interview by Dr. Solomon and others at Tampa General Hospital?
yes.
And please tell us what information or did you glean from that interview that provides the basis or evidence of your opinion that the defendant at the time of the offenses knew what she was doing and the consequences of her act?
Okay, just one moment. During the 1/29/11 interview, she talked about that she felt her husband was planning for divorce. She talked about that letter. She was very angry about it. She said that he had lost his compassionate self. He did not teach the children compassion. She basically said that she had planned this for quite a while. She says I planned, and planned. And that is consistent with some of the evidence that we have. She indicates that she had screwed up and she was a failure, and when asked, she said, well, I didn't take myself out. I passed out before I could shoot myself. So she knew, she was, during this interview, she was coherent, she was relevant, her remarks were spontaneous. Not always the case on the 12811 interview with the police, but when she did give coherent information on the 12811 interview with police, it was right on in terms of what happened. So basically, she reports that this is what she did, this is why I did it, and then when she first gets to Hillsborough County Jail, there's a notation that said, I shot my kids, I might hurt myself, I want to be in heaven with my kids. Again, she knew that her kids were in heaven. She knew that she had wished she had completed her plan, which was to end her life with them.
How do you view, and to what significance, if any, do you attach to the defendant's statements during the January 28, 2011 interview with Tampa Police Department detectives, where she asks, are my children coming down here, and makes similar statements, arguably indicating that she thinks they're still alive?
Yeah, like I said, there clearly was evidence in the 12811 police interview at times where she was incoherent, where she seemed impaired. She was maybe sedated at some point, but there were many more times where she was very relevant and very accurate with regard to what had happened, and what she said was supported by things that had actually happened and were evident in other pieces of information. As far as that particular statement, this is an individual who had just shot her children, and a very large number of people who commit killings, shootings, murders, will have what's called a dissociative episode, and that's where they sort of lose their grasp. They can come kind of in and out of, am I here, am I not there? And it could have been that. The other thing, though, that I think it's most attributable to is that she was under the influence of lithium in toxic levels and Coumadin, a blood thinner. Lithium is a mood stabilizer. Soon after this, within hours, she is sent to Tampa General Hospital, and she's diagnosed with lithium toxicity and Coumadin poisoning. And so I know from my training and my education that people who are toxic on lithium can be confused, they can be shaky, tremulousness, they can have fatigue, they can slur their words. And so it may have very much been related to that as well. And the reason why I wasn't that...
Objection, non-responsive at this point.
Your next question, sir.
Yes, sir. That evidence, did that statement or those statements that she made during the January 28th police interview cause you concern sufficient to question your opinion as to whether she was psychotic at the time of the offense?
No, I never thought that she was psychotic supported by that interview.
Okay. Let me ask you something somewhat related. You've indicated that, or addressed the issue of the toxic levels of lithium in her system and other drugs on board. Have you viewed the video of the defendant being let out from the Tampa Police Department station?
Yes.
Okay. And did you observe tremors exhibited by the defendant's limbs and head and other facial symptoms?
Yes.